Welcome, guys. Andrew here. One of the questions I get pretty frequently, or some of the confusion I see pretty frequently when teaching people Capture One, is how to handle outputs. And Capture One has a couple ways of doing outputs. So one of them is you can, of course, select the variant, right click, and say export original or variants. And if the original is going to be the unedited version and the variants is going to be all the different edits you've done. And you get kind of this clunky one-off dialog box. I don't use this. I don't recommend you don't use this. So if I go to my process tab, which is the little gear right here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a collection and filter that collection so that I've got it showing what I want to show. I've got 8 images here. And I'll go over here to the process tab. At the top of the process tab, if you haven't changed anything, you should have this process recipes. And by default, you're going to have 3 or 4 default recipes that Capture One put there. And I've created one called a not useful recipe, because most of the recipes they put there are not anything I would use by default. And you can just go ahead and remove those. Make sure whichever one is selected with orange or gray is the one you got selected, and you can click minus. Okay. Now, I've got a set of recipes here. I've actually got quite a few recipes. Each of these recipes serves a distinct purpose. So for example, I've got a social media export. I've got a 4K version of that export that's a higher resolution version. I use Digicam for my archiving. So I've got a couple recipes related to that. I've got a Zenfolio recipe for delivering photos to clients, and I've got some other ones below. But the key is here, I don't reproduce the recipe every time I do something. You save these recipes and they exist. So let's look at my social recipe. So I've got it selected in orange. If I go down here, I've got the process recipes area. And this is the area that describes the recipe for you. So we can look at the basic tab in the process recipe. It's a JPEG export. It's got 8-bit depth. There's only one option for JPEG because it only supports 8-bit. I've set my quality metric to 63. My ICC profile to sRGB. And then I'm scaling it to 2000 pixels on the long edge. So you notice I've skipped resolution, and I'm not doing anything with open width. So we're going to ignore that for now. Resolution is completely irrelevant unless you're scaling by inches or centimeters. It does not make any difference at all unless you're scaling by inches or centimeters. It's the conversion factor from pixels to the real world. There are other tabs, and we'll go into these other tabs in a minute. We're going to set up some basic recipes. Just know that there's a lot of options with these recipes, and what happens is you basically save these. So there's social. Let's look at my Digicam. This is my master archive collection. JPEG again. I can always go back to the RAW, so I don't worry about it being JPEG. I'm trying to save space in my archive. I've got 95% quality. I'm exporting it Adobe RBG, and I'm exporting it fixed 100%. And fixed is what Capture One calls scaling by percentage. So let's set up a basic recipe. Most people are going to need effectively 2 recipes to start with. You're going to need a social media export for sharing your photos on Facebook, Instagram, or a blog. And you're going to need a full resolution version that's high quality in case you want to edit it or you're going to print it or something similar, not inside Capture One. So for example, if you're going to print from Capture One, these recipes don't matter at all because you're printing directly from the RAW. But if you're going to upload it to a print-on-demand service, take it into your local camera store and have it printed, then you're going to need a JPEG or some other non-RAW format. So let's go ahead. I'm going to create a new recipe. And see, it comes up untitled. And right now I can edit this recipe. So I'm going to call this for sharing. And this is going to be a version of my social, okay? So if we look at the process recipe down here, again, we have this one selected. Format, well, we're going to use JPEG because that's the universal. But you can see there are a lot of other versions, JPEG QuickProof, XR, and JPEG 2000. TIFF, DNG, PNG, and PSD. This is an example for sharing. So our quality does not need to be 100, and you can play with your recipe and see where you want this quality slider. I will tell you from experience that the JPEG compression engine in Capture One is pretty good, and even with the fairly low quality metric, you will get essentially artifact-free results. So I'm going to put that to 50. Now, if I look at my ICC profile, I've got a couple of options. And by default, it only shows me ones it thinks are relevant. I can export it with the embedded camera profile. That's probably not what I want to do if I'm editing RAWs, unless I'm doing something specific like color profiling, creating ICC profiles from the output. Or I can go with one of the two suggested, sRBG or Adobe RPG. If I say show all, it shows me every single color profile on my computer, including things like printer paper profiles for my photo printer. Now, there are a couple of other profiles you might use besides Adobe and sRBG, and one is wide gamut. So let's talk about specifically the two most common options, Adobe and sRBG. sRGB stands for either Screen RGB or Safe RGB, and it's a color profile and a color space that has a fairly limited number of colors, but it's designed so that most devices on the web, most phones, most monitors, even low-end monitors and phones, can display all the colors the file can contain. So your color profile defines what colors you can possibly represent with that file. So for a social media export, this is actually the right answer. And the reason this is the right answer is because when you upload it to Instagram or Facebook, in all likelihood, it's going to down convert it to sRGB for you. So you'd rather do that now and have control over it than let that happen behind the scenes. Adobe RGB is a wider gamut color profile, and it lets you represent many more colors than sRGB does. So it is ideal for things like printing, where your output device has a much wider color gamut than a normal monitor has. It's also good for editing. Now, there are other profiles, wide gamut, ProPhoto, RGB, etc., that have different gamuts. There's also some video-specific gamuts. By and large, unless you're doing something very specific and have started to delve into the details of these color profiles, you can essentially in your mind equate Adobe RGB for archiving, printing, and editing, and sRGB for sharing. You can call that sharing RGB. So this is a sharing profile, so we're going to do sharing. Resolution, 300 pixels per inch, pixels per millimeter, pixels per centimeter. Well, here's the trick. Resolution makes no difference whatsoever in the output if you aren't picking a scaling. Let's do width. Now see, if I pick 5 inches, I've said scale this to 5 inches, but what does 5 inches mean in the pixel world? Well, we look at the resolutions. 300 pixels per inch times 5, that's 1500 pixels. Well, that's just kind of goofy if we're working in the world of pixels, so why go through that? Just go to pixels, and you could say, I'm going to make this 2000 pixels on the long edge. So let's go here and go long edge. And it resets it to inches. And we're going to go 2000. Okay? So what I've done here is I've said, when I export this picture, make this edge 2000 pixels, this top edge, because it's the longer of the two edges. If this had been a portrait orientation picture, it'd make this 2000 pixels. So doing long edge or short edge gives you the ability to control sort of the maximum dimension the photo has. You could also do width or height, which stipulates, hey, the width is exactly 2000 pixels or the height is exactly 2000 pixels, and it doesn't care what orientation the photo has. So if it's portrait orientation or landscape orientation, it's going to make, let's do width. It's going to make this 2000 pixels. Now, in all these situations where I'm setting one edge of the photo, Capture One does not distort the photo, so it will make the other dimension fit appropriately. So if I say on this photo 2000 pixels, it's going to make the height of this photo like 1200 or 1300 pixels. If I make the width on this photo 2000 pixels, it's going to make the height like 3500 pixels because it's portrait orientation. Now, if I were to do long edge, let's say, it's going to make the height 2000 pixels and the width, let's say 1200 or 1400 pixels. And on a landscape orientation, it's going to make the width 2000 pixels and the height like 12 or 1500 pixels. So there are some other options here. Width and height, you can specify a bounding box. Now what this means is I'm going to say, hey, 1500 by 1200 pixels. It's going to scale the image so it's as big as it can possibly be and fit in that box. It is not going to distort the image. So if I do something like 1500 by 200, my image is going to be 1500 by 200 high. Well, 200 is so small, it's going to make the height of this image 200, and it's going to be very narrow, maybe 300 wide, even though I've said it can be up to 1500, because this is a very shallow aspect ratio. It will not distort the image. Dimension will fit the image inside a box, but it orients that box, 1500 by 1200, to be the same orientation as your photo. So this is a landscape photo, and I've said 1500 by 1200. So it's going to be 1500 wide by 1200 high as the box that'll go in. It'll make this as big as possible to fit in that box. This photo, as a portrait orientation photo, will be the box it will use will be 1500 high by 1200 wide. It will rotate that box. So what I usually do is long edge, and for sharing I do anywhere from 1500 to 2500 pixels. So I'm going to say 2000 pixels on the long edge. I'm not going to open it with anything afterwards. That's fine. So let's go ahead and look at the other tabs. Each recipe includes information about where to put the files you export. Root folder is the base that this whole system works on, and the default is output location. What does output location mean? Well, if you scroll down here, you'll see there's an output location tool panel. And by default, it'll say choose folder, and there won't be a folder picked, okay? Once you've picked some, there's some stuff in your list here. So this is sort of like a master top folder you can set. And then you can specify a subfolder, and you see this box with a dot, dot, dot here. You can build a format, and that format can use any of the metadata that is included in your catalog or images. So for example, I'm going to go down here and I'm going to pick document name. And document name is what Capture One calls the catalog name. And then I'm going to put test, okay? So I can put a slash there, and I can put something else to have subdirectories. You can see sample. It's going to put this stuff in a subfolder of Syndicate called 2018-10-29 Halloween Dog /test. Now let's just say that's not what I want to do. Well, so this is set once for the entire thing, but what's more useful is to go up here, instead of saying output folder, image folder is where these images currently live. I don't normally use that because I store things inside the catalog. But I can go to select folder here. And now I'm going to go to my desktop, and let's just for giggles pick Syndicate, because Syndicate is a folder on my desktop where I dump things for social sharing and temporary use. And then I'm going to create a subfolder called social sharing, okay? Now, subfolder could use a format. I'm just making it a really simple fixed name. And subname is a field that can be used in things like the output file naming, so you can just ignore it for now. Okay? So what we've done here is we've said, hey, output anything processed with recipe to a folder called Syndicate/social sharing on my desktop. Now, I could have selected this folder directly in the root folder, and that would have worked too. This really gets powerful when we do the formats, and I'll show you that in a minute. Adjustments. This is where you get to do things like, do I want to use the crop or do I want to ignore the crop? And if you pick PSD, you can export as a crop path instead of actually cropping the image. Normally for social media, I want to export it the way I've cropped it. Okay. Sharpening, they have some default sharpening built in here. Output sharpening for screen, output sharpening for print, disable all sharpening, and no output sharpening. So what's the difference between disable all and no output sharpening? Output sharpening is in addition to what you've done when you edited the image. Disable all turns off the sharpening you might have done when you edited the image. So normally we don't sharpen images when we edit them, at least not much, because sharpening is output specific. You sharpen different for print than you do for online display, and you sharpen different depending on the resolution. Sharpening is size dependent. So you can do no output sharpening if you've already got things where you want. I'm going to export this for screen, so I'm going to do output sharpening for screen. Disable all would be useful, for example, if you're going to do more post-processing in Photoshop or something, and you want to save sharpening to the very last step, which you normally do. Okay? So we'll do no output sharpening, or sorry, output sharpening for screen. And you can see what happens is you have some controls down here now. Amount, radius, and threshold. This is the default. You can change it. I'm going to leave it alone. On the metadata tab, we can control what metadata gets included in our file. So color and rating and color tag says, hey, do I want to include, this was a 3-star in the metadata. I normally include that. I want to include my copyright. So these other ones are something you may choose to turn on and off. GPS coordinates. I don't want people to know where I took the photo. You might want that, you might not. Camera metadata. Do I want people to know what lens, what camera profile I was using, what focus length, etc.? Yes or no. That's up to you. And all of the metadata is other metadata that gets dumped in the file, such as extra camera manufacturer specific metadata. So normally on a social export, I will only leave my rating and my copyright. Now, this workflow section down here, you can do things like annotations. So Capture One 11 Pro includes annotations, which is basically the ability to scribble on the image. And that's useful if you're going to send a photo to a retoucher and you want to send them a marked up version also. Hey, I need to sharpen his face, dodge this area, etc. I don't use that, so that's not really necessary. And then overlays are a way of turning on almost like a stamp over the image. Again, I don't really use overlays, but there's something you can do if you want to export digital proofs, for example, etc. Watermarking, they support image and text. I don't watermark my images. It's, in my opinion, utterly pointless and it ruins images. Nothing's worse than a nice image with a watermark stuck on the corner. And watermarks inevitably end up looking really out of date and tacky pretty quick, no matter how tasteful you think it is. That's my opinion. You can watermark if you want, it supports it. So I'm going to do none here. So now we've got this recipe set up. At this point, you should be asking yourself, what's the image going to be named? You'll notice there's no, in the file tab, there's no image naming here. And this is something I wish Capture One would move into the recipe, because it turns out most of my file naming I want to have associated with the recipe, because each of the things I do, I name a certain way. It's not though. So I'm going to go down here to output naming. So whatever recipes you pick, and you can pick more than one recipe. You can see I can check 3 of these. It's going to use the same output naming. So if I go down here to output naming, and I click this ... format image name. Well, image name is the little name of the image. I've got some presets I've saved, and they've got some generic presets down here. Okay, image name plus job name, image name plus subname, job name plus 3-digit counter. Let's use that one. So the sample shows us it's 012. Well, 012, where's the job name? Well, job name is a field you can type here. So I type that there, I get a sample. It's going to be, these are going to be named Superhero Dog -012. The output counter can be reset right here. Reset output counter, set output counter to a certain thing. And you can set the increment. So you can add 1 every time, or you can add 10 every time. It doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want. So I'm going to reset my output counter. So I'll be at 1. So here we have Superhero Dog 01. So the final step is to select the images I want to export. I'm going to export all 12 of these. Sorry, all 8 of these. I've got my recipe picked for social sharing. I've got my naming set the way I want. And then all I do is click process. And now it's going to go through and process all of those. You can see the progress on your batch tab. And this one was a small batch, so it went away before I got here. But you can see if you do 1,000 images, they'll be here. You can see which one you're on and when you're complete. So let's go look at those images. So if I go to my desktop, syndicate, social sharing, I now have 8 images here. And if we go to this view, you can see that they are 1335 by 2000, 1335 by 2000, 2000 by 1335. So you can see long edge made whichever edge is longer have the correct aspects, the correct size. So let's look at a couple other things you can do with process recipes now that we've got the basics. So you're probably going to set up a basic social sharing. The other thing you'll probably want to do is set up some archiving, especially if you use project-based catalogs like I use. So every catalog is one project. which means I go into a master archive and I organize my images by project. So if I look at this Digicam, let's uncheck that one. Digicam with collection. So my basic, it's a 95% quality JPEG, Adobe RBG, 100% resolution. In other words, I don't scale it at all. Now the File tab is where things get interesting. I'm putting it in my master portfolio folder in a subfolder called Incoming, Document Name. Let's go ahead and look here. Collection Name. So document name is the name of the project, the name of the catalog, and collection name is the name of whatever collection you have selected here. In this case, all images. Okay, so if I go back to that recipe and I export this, well, let's change the file naming because I use a different naming. I have a Digicam naming scheme I use. It uses the year, month, and day the photo was exported. So if I export it multiple times, it doesn't overwrite with the image name, the original image name. And you can see 2018 11/19 AF 32272. That's the original file name from my Nikon. So I'm just going to go ahead and export one of these to show you what this does. So here we have my master portfolio directory, and you can see 2017, 2018, and then I have this incoming area because there's a little bit of work I do as these come in. It's my archive. I do some tagging, etc. And if I go to 2018 1029, all images is the collection I had selected, and there is my full resolution image. And of course, preview is only showing me a low-res version of that. But if I go here, coming, Halloween dogs, all images, you can see that's 4,900 pixels by 7,300 pixels. That's a D810 file that hasn't been cropped. Okay, so in this case, with the collection doesn't make any sense because I'm on all images. Here's a catalog where I've got 3 user collections. 1211 Lexington Street, Granger Lake, and Class. This is the catalog I use to show people how to put together star trails. So if I go to my recipes, and I go up here and I pick Digicam with collections, you can see I've got this naming scheme here that involves the catalog name, document name, and the collection name. So let's just go ahead and export one of those. Check our output naming, Digicam naming, perfect. So if we open that up in Finder, we've got a folder called 2016-05-04 Star Trails, 1211 Lexington, which is the collection the image was in, and there's the image. Now, if I had, when I exported that, if I had chosen all images, even if I exported that exact same image, I would have not gotten the 1211 Lexington Street. I'd have gotten all images. What you have selected here determines that collection name. So hopefully that's demystified the process tab and recipes for you a little bit. If there's one thing you take away from this, it's that every time you do an export, you should not be creating a new recipe. I have quite a few recipes here, and they all serve very specific purposes. Most people, at least when you start out, you should have 2 or 3 recipes. You should have a sharing recipe and an archive recipe, and maybe a recipe for exporting for retouching. Anyways, so give this a shot. Let me know in the comments what I didn't cover, if you have specific questions that I didn't cover, and I'm happy to answer them. And if you enjoy my content, go ahead and click that thumbs up button. Click the subscribe button, and I'll check you next time.